Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. Empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your co-host, Joanne.
And on today's show, May 31st, 2017, we speak with Dr. Christopher Davidson. Davidson is a scholar and expert of Middle East politics who teaches at Durham University in Northern England. He is the author of numerous books, including his latest, Shadow Wars, The Secret Struggle for the Middle East, based on 4 years of archival work and interviews with former intelligence officials. Here is that interview.
Hello, Dr. Davidson. Thanks so much for doing this interview with us today.
Many thanks for having me on your show. It's a great delight.
As we discussed, I thought today we could talk about your book, Shadow Wars. And since the tragic attack in Manchester gives us a good opportunity to focus in on the kind of the origins of the problems that you describe in your book, and I don't know if it's fair to call it blowback, or the results of foreign policy manipulations and choices of the West. And maybe we could even talk a little bit about the effects on the upcoming election, take advantage of the fact that we have a well-informed Brit in our midst who can help us understand what's going on from that aspect too. So maybe we could start with an overview for people who haven't read the book yet of what the main points are that you're making, and then we can switch over to Manchester and we'll see how it goes.
Well, the starting point for the Shadow Wars project was really to try to do a bit of reverse engineering, to look at the truly chaotic situation across much of the Middle East and broader Islamic world today, stretching, of course, from North Africa across to the Levant and even onto the Arabian Peninsula, and trying to look at how, through periods of history, there have been repeated attempts to engineer outcomes in the region, largely to suit the interests of major imperial powers, notably Britain, and then later the United States, and especially the United States by the mid-20th century, as it started to wake up to the realities of its resource-hungry industries that demanded monopolies or oligopolies, often in cooperation with Western European companies, in these incredibly resource-rich parts of the world, especially the Persian Gulf and other parts of the Arab region too. Now, of course, there was more to it than that. By the 1950s and 1960s, we also had a Cold War that needed to be won as well. And many of these Arab nationalist movements, or even the democratically elected Mossadegh government in Persia, in Iran, threatened this status quo in the region. It threatened the sphere of influence that Britain and America had enjoyed. These largely secular nationalists were not only threatening to take economic monopolies out of the hands of Western companies, but were also threatening to gravitate towards the Soviet Union. Their Achilles heel, if you like, was that they were largely secular movements in what was still a deeply religious society. Therefore, we had repeated attempts, culminating, of course, in jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and many other events around the region, where we saw Britain and the United States repeatedly co-opting the most conservative religious forces, including jihadist organizations, that could be used as proxies to either weaken the secular Arab nationalist movements, or ultimately weaken and draw the Soviet Union into a trap as well. Now, of course, we can go through the archives, we can interview former officials, and repeatedly we find British and American grandees who are willing to go on the record and say they were worried about this. They were worried about allying with some of the most dangerous religiously conservative groups in the region, even though they recognized it would help them win the Cold War by bringing the Soviet Union to its knees in Afghanistan. They recognized there would be the potential for blowback. Now, of course, we had blowback beginning by the late 1990s. We had Al-Qaeda, which was very much a child of the Afghan jihad of the 80s, launching embassy bombings on US compounds in East Africa. We had the USS Cole being hit. And then, of course, a couple of years later, we had the biggest blowback of all, 9/11 itself.
Right. So they were always conflicted. I mean, they knew that this was that there was real potential risk in it. And I would say that it conflicts with some of our basic ideologies, the things we preach, democracy, freedom and democracy, and then we were working against the secular movements in the Middle East. So that took some real pretzel logic to hide the real motives, the real foreign policy, which we still find today. You know, we put these very simplistic good guy, bad guy myths out front.
It's also interesting how it changed. I can't help but think, since we're talking about Afghanistan, that Zbigniew Brzezinski died this week. And in his memo that he wrote to President Carter, he said explicitly, we're going to try to create a, quote, green belt, which is an idea of very, hardcore religious Islam as a way to defeat the godless communists. And I wonder if, as someone who studied it a little bit longer, and maybe I'm biasing on the British perspective, it seemed like there was a transition from the old imperial systems. So, for example, President Barack Obama, essentially apologized for the U.S. overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran in the 50s. It was close to an apology. The conservatives here screamed it was an apology tour. But in that case, it was really British Petroleum, before it became Beyond Petroleum, right? And Winston Churchill, I think, who tried to talk Eisenhower into launching this, right, as a continuation of Anglo-American power. I mean, what's your sense of the dynamic from the old colonial powers to the new colonial power, which is the U.S. and arguably the Soviet Union, right?
The modern empire, yeah.
Well, from my perspective, there's actually a remarkable amount of continuity here. If we were to go back to the aftermath of the Russian Revolution after 1979, we see the Churchill organized multinational front to try to bring the Bolsheviks down, actually including Islamist groups in Central Asia committed to founding a Sharia law Islamic emirate. We have British officials on the record recognizing the dangers of this group, but nonetheless understanding it was a means of actually providing a significant thorn in the soft southern underbelly of the Bolshevik state. So in this sense, this is really nothing new. We have by the 1950s and 1960s a recognition in London and Washington that the Saudi kings could potentially be transformed into the next caliphs, the next caliphate, as an alternative to the secular Nasser administration in Egypt, which was threatening to spread its tentacles across the region, essentially creating an anti-imperial front against British and American interests. These are the same Saudi kings, including King Faisal, who in the 1960s tours the United States and preaches against the vile Jews with distinctly anti-Semitic language. But nonetheless, time and again, a cost-benefit analysis is performed, and the US and Britain frequently err on the side of supporting the religious conservative groups. You mentioned Brzezinski, the Carter administration, etc., in the late 70s and 1980s. We have here a clear understanding from Brzezinski, as he later revealed in interviews several years after the jihad, that they had consciously backed the most vicious and dangerous groups in Afghanistan, the most likely to create a bloody Vietnam-like situation for the Soviet Union. In this sense, they had alternative groups, insurgent groups they could have backed in Afghanistan, but they deliberately went for the groups led by characters such as Hekmatyar, Abdullah Azzam, and eventually bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. So the decisions were conscious and they were always there. You mentioned Barack Obama's apology for the Mossadegh coup in the early 1950s. Well, yeah, that's all well and good. But at the time, Britain also had a plan B in the 1950s, which was to support Ayatollah Kashani and the religious conservatives in Iran. The same religious establishment which 25 years later, of course, actually assumes power. This is the same Barack Obama administration which oversaw the funding of weapons and other logistical support to groups in Syria and Libya after 2011, which, let's be fair about it, are not that dissimilar to the sort of groups the United States was backing in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Al-Nusra. I mean, Al-Nusra was the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and by the end of it, in theory, there was supposed to be this Free Syrian Army, but they were told, and we've talked to people, associated with the CIA, who said, look, we knew as soon as we gave these weapons to these people in Turkey, they were going to go in and partner up with Jabhat al-Nusra, which was literally the al-Qaeda affiliate. They knew that their allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, Turkey, were helping ISIS form, that they had opened the border for, quote, jihadi highway.
Yeah,
the tradition has continued.
Yeah, I think we have from the email podesta leaks of the Hillary campaign, a recognition from Hillary Clinton herself, presidential candidate, that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. But here I think we come to the interesting bit. After 2011, the support for religious extremist groups by the United States and their Western European allies necessarily has to become a bit more discreet and a few steps removed. Of course, in the wake of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the prospect of direct Western boots on the ground military interventions in the Middle East or the Islamic world become impossible, given the prospect of public backlash to any democratically elected Western politician. So we have to get more and more into these proxy or shadow wars, where the Western powers rely ever more heavily on their regional allies, notably the conservative Sunni Arab Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, etc., to be doing the sponsoring and weaponizing of the boots on the ground. Yet in Libya, America, Britain, and France could provide the air cover. They provided a bit of air cover over Syria as well. But the bottom line is the groups on the ground have mainly been weaponized by our allies. In that sense, we'll never find the same kind of paper trail linking al-Nusra or other al-Qaeda affiliates back to the CIA or MI6 as we did right up until the 1990s.
And also Obama did a lot with the special forces, the covert operations, put a lot of resources into it and prioritized it more in our wars. So that's another reason why we won't find out, or be harder to find out. Anyway, we actually have some special forces talk to Jack Murphy of SOFREP and told them that there was a dissatisfaction. They don't want to train Al-Qaeda. He has a quote literally saying that. Also with Al-Qaeda, we have the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which it's established that that's an Al-Qaeda affiliated, or was an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, right? Now, they were removed from the State Department. I think they were removed from the designated terrorist list in 2015 because they rebranded, or did they rebrand? Did they really dissolve? And the attacker in Manchester has an affiliation with this group, right? Maybe you could tell us more about the LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, because this is the same kind of thing.
Well, yes, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group very much has its origins in the Afghan Jihad and Al-Qaeda itself. These were Libyans who had gone across to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 80s to fight against the secular Afghani government and ultimately the Soviet soldiers as well. When they returned to Libya, they found an increasingly secular nationalist Gaddafi regime that they sought to undermine. Naturally, many of the LIFG exiles have gravitated to Britain. Many, as we now know, were offered asylum. Over the course of the 1990s, we are now aware, as a result of leaked documents and whistleblower statements, some of which the British government attempted to block with a D notice, that MI6 had actually tried to fund and weaponize the LIFG to carry out a coup d'etat in the mid-1990s against Gaddafi's secular administration. LIFG members were living in London, Dublin, and of course, Manchester. In fact, when an apartment belonging to an LIFG member in Manchester was eventually raided, it uncovered the massive so-called terrorist training manual instructing people how to make improvised explosive devices, etc. 9/11 comes and goes, and it's as late as 2004 in the US's case before they finally recognize and acknowledge LIFG is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And the British government takes a year longer, 2005, before they grudgingly do so as well. Grudgingly, of course, because they were de facto in an alliance with the LIFG for the best part of the previous decade. These are the same characters, of course, who represent the previous generation of the recent Manchester bomber. We have to fast forward a bit to 2011. The LIFG and its remnants and its community in Manchester and elsewhere again become important for the Western powers. They are people who are able to go over to Libya. We know that their Home Office restriction orders, their Ministry of Interior restriction orders were removed to allow them to go and join the jihad in 2011, which was being packaged by most of the Western mainstream media as yet another part of the Arab Spring and yet another organic popular revolution led by the majority of the Libyan people. Of course, the reality, as we're now starting to see as evidence accumulates, is that the Libyan revolution was by far organic and by far representing the majority of the population.
And it's generational now, right? We have the father, Ramadan, is it Abedi? And we have the son. So the people who talk about the implications and the blowback from all this creating generational enemies. We have sort of hard evidence of that here, don't we?
Yeah, in my own sort of scholarly pursuits, I don't really buy into this academic discipline of jihadology, where we work out who's related to whom and what they ate for breakfast in the morning or whether they did an engineering degree. It's far more important we look at the real policies by governments and key organizations in the region and internationally that have historically supported these groups, put weapons in their hand and put money in their pockets. That, I think, is where most of our research should be conducted. That said, one of the big takeaways I think we can make from this massive, well-funded academic discipline of jihad studies is that generations do matter. Father to son, uncle to nephew, it really matters. We can trace these sorts of links. And in Manchester, absolutely, we do have evidence accumulating now that very much a community had been allowed to develop, prosper, being granted asylum, protection even, and are very much with us even today in 2017. On the one hand, they were deemed as strategic but volatile assets by the Western intelligence agencies, while on the other, of course, they were also recognized as being potentially dangerous here at home.
What's the strategy? Can you go into a bit? I mean, because I think Libya has more of a UK dimension perhaps than it does in the US. I mean, we don't like Gaddafi. I know we all know Reagan bombed him in the famous circle of death or something like that. It's all kind of vague, to be honest, because Reagan was bombing a lot of people and funding a lot of covert activity that blew up in his face. So can you talk about when they say strategic assets, I'm trying to think, what is the national interest of the UK and its involvement in Libya? Is it just because Gaddafi and the Lockerbie bombing? I mean, can you go into that a bit? What's the background there?
Well, I think as far as Britain, and we shouldn't forget Sarkozy's France was concerned, Gaddafi's Libya was representing a vast untapped market for British, French, and other Western companies. We're not just talking oil concessions, we're talking an oil-rich country that is spending heavily on infrastructure. Gaddafi's Libya was building schools, building universities, building hospitals, roads, canals, bridges, you name it. This was a wealthy, stable country. Brutal dictatorship, but wealthy and stable. Many of these contracts were not going to Western companies. We have this sort of rapprochement from about 2003 onwards. Gaddafi, of course, is very alarmed by what's happened to Saddam. He states in the Arab League it could happen to any of us next. Gaddafi starts to push various sons of his as more moderate figures in front of him. Goldman Sachs gets involved with the Libyan Sovereign Wealth Fund. MI6 gets involved, starts writing speeches for Gaddafi. Gaddafi apologizes for Lockerbie, etc. Tony Blair goes over to meet him. British and other foreign academics go to meet Gaddafi and proclaim he's had, a new turn and a new vision for the future. And we have, not coincidentally, a gravy train of European and American companies turning up to sign contracts up until about 2010. Even British weapons were being sold to Gaddafi as late as summer 2010. But then, of course, we have the realization that Gaddafi is becoming problematic again. He's asking for kickbacks. He's trying to siphon off some of this Western investment into national funds. He's starting to talk about new Pan-African currency. He's starting to talk about selling Libyan oil not in dollars or pounds, but in some other sort of currency. So we have Gaddafi by the end of 2010, again, almost going back 10 years in time, problematic once more. The Arab Spring begins, Tunisia, Egypt, elsewhere, catching the region by storm, seemingly a domino effect. And as far as we can see, the opportunity was too golden to miss to package an insurgency in Libya, in the east and west, but not primarily in the capital city, as part of the Arab Spring revolutions.
Right, and it's interesting because that was what you described, that history there, and that's what I thought. I said, well, okay, so there's the carrot and the stick approach, right? Saddam Hussein refuses to give in. He gets overthrown, and it was sold in the United States that that's going to send a message throughout the region. So Gaddafi complies. He gives up the weapons of mass destruction. He agrees to integrate. He pays restitution, and they overthrow him anyway. So what message does that send? Talk about mixed messages.
Also in 2008, Christopher Stevens sends a cable saying that, Gaddafi is a great ally in the fight against terrorism, and he's disrupting foreign fighter flows. It's pretty weird there.
Well, if the message from overthrowing Saddam was play ball or you'll be sorry, and then Gaddafi plays ball and he's still sorry, that's not much of a policy, is it?
Well, I think there are two things to note there. Yes, Gaddafi did begin to play ball, but by 2010 it was clear he wasn't playing ball well enough. We have other WikiLeaks from 2009 and 2010 indicating the US embassy in the region was receiving complaints from Western companies that they were being asked to pay bribes and pay money into slush funds for Libyan government purposes, etc. I think the other point to note is that what message does this send? Well, it sends a strong message today to current US allies, notably Saudi Arabia, which of course was thrust forward as current White House's Arab ally number one over the past few weeks. And I think the king and princes of Saudi Arabia need to take a good, long, hard look at Libya in the past decade. They need to take a very, very good, long, hard look at Saddam Hussein up until 2003. And I think they even need to take a look at Assad up to 2011. We shouldn't forget that for the decade preceding 2011, Bashar al-Assad, British educated, British white, loads of Qatari funding from a major US ally trying to reinvigorate the Syrian economy. Syria was being brought in from the cold. David Miliband, British Foreign Secretary, went out there in 2007, proclaimed his cooperation with the Assad regime. So, we had Assad Syria being primed for opening up its economy. By 2010, again, clear it's not playing ball properly. 2011, another golden opportunity presents itself to package insurgencies as part of the Arab Spring. So this sends out a very clear message, I think, to current US allies, especially current US allies in the region, that seem to be having to pay a lot to US companies, including weapons companies, and are being, let's say, strong-armed into investing heavily in the US economy at a time they really can't afford it due to low oil prices.
Syria was also participating in the CIA torture program. Jihadists were being renditioned, is the term for it, where because there's certain restrictions on torture for the U.S. government, although it's not always clear we follow them, we would send them to places like Egypt, Jordan, and Syria to be tortured. So when you see American officials, or U.S. officials at least, say, oh, Assad, he's this horrible torturer. That's why we were in business together, because we would send him detainees taken off the battlefield or wherever, and he would torture them for the U.S. So bring in from the cold, I guess.
There were, I forget if it was WikiLeaks documents or cables that indicated, or it may have been emails actually, involving Hillary. Brad Hoff wrote about it. I mean, Gaddafi was also stockpiling gold, right? And didn't he have plans to, wasn't Gaddafi in general favor of giving African countries more independence and possibly their own currency, and to, try to stop or soften the exploitation of Africa?
Right. I think, if we can push temporarily to one side the rather brutal at times authoritarian nature of Gaddafi's regime, at heart this was an African project. Earlier in his reign, as it were, Gaddafi, of course, had tried to embellish his Arab nationalist credentials. That was very difficult, given the relative weight of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and etc. But Gaddafi, I think, by the 1980s and certainly 1990s, had realised very, very well that Libya's relative wealthy status on the African continent could be used to generate enormous influence and soft power across Africa in Libya's name. Yes, I think by 2010 even, Gaddafi was still very much committed to this. He was trying to use Libyan wealth to fund infrastructure projects, for example, in Southeast Africa, in parts of West Africa too. I think in many ways, Gaddafi was also seen as a military obstacle by the United States. Their AFRICOM project by 2010 was struggling. They didn't have a proper base on the African continent. It was actually based in Italy at the time. Gaddafi and Goodluck Jonathan's government in Nigeria were the two principal African states that blocked any expansion of US AFRICOM military command onto the African continent. We fast forward to 2011, summer 2011, half of the problem is dealt with. We fast forward to January 2015, the other half of the problem is dealt with, as Goodluck Jonathan's government is ousted democratically by the former military dictator Muhammadu Buhari, who essentially wins on a ticket of greater security because of the rising threat of Islamic State-aligned Boko Haram. Now, as the evidence piles up on Boko Haram, it becomes increasingly apparent that major Western allies in the Arab world, including Gulf states, have very much been involved in the funding and weaponizing of Boko Haram. The point is, we end up in 2015 with Nigeria's economy being dramatically opened up to foreign investment. We have a Nigerian president in place who had tried 4 previous times to be elected and had failed, assuming power on a military ticket. Meanwhile, a jihadist group runs rampage in the northeastern provinces of the country.
Nothing stands in the way of the imperial ambitions, in other words.
It sounds like a playbook, the way you laid it out there, which...
The playbook, is unfolding before our eyes, and what's remarkable, really, if one studies the history and traces it back several decades, is the lack of originality. If we look at the Philippines at the moment, what do we have? The Philippines government, not cooperative, not forming part of a military ring of steel around China in US interest. Hey presto, we have an Islamic State insurgency, and by the way, this Islamic State insurgency that the government is currently having to fight includes plenty of foreign fighters, Yemenis, Chechens, and even Saudis. How did Saudis get all the way to Indonesia and take part in an ISIS insurgency against a deeply uncooperative government?
Makes sense why when Trump went then, maybe he wasn't so out of step, because a lot of us here, particularly who followed the campaign closely, said, man, he's really attacking Saudi Arabia. When it was brought up that Saudi Arabia donated to the Clinton Foundation, he said, Saudi Arabia is sponsors of 9/11. They keep women. They kill gays. And it became this very reactionary point. And then when he gets to Saudi Arabia suddenly transforms into the Golden Kingdom. He's never been to a place so beautiful. They're committed. They're really committed to fighting terrorism. Suddenly, Iran is the focus of terrorism throughout the world, despite the numbers not adding up. I think one survey, I actually saw CNN put this out, that 94% of jihadist violence is Sunni-based, not Shia-based. Is that what happened? Or maybe the deep state or whoever, or he was consultant, said, actually, the Saudis are on the team, so don't go there and insult them.
Well, I think the current White House administration has played this remarkably carefully. Clearly during the presidential campaign, they had an election to win, and they needed to tap in to a particular populist vote, where Saudi Arabia was, correctly identified by many Americans as a major state sponsor of terrorism. Trump, as far as I can see, has read the evidence. He's read the declassified 28, 29 pages and various other documents. This is beyond circumstantial evidence, providing some sort of causal link between state-run charities in Saudi Arabia and the 9/11 hijackers. 15 of 19, of course, were very much Saudi nationals. Now we fast forward to 2017. We have, I think, the Trump camp, the White House, has performed a cost-benefit analysis of its own. It knows that turning up to Saudi Arabia, signing these big weapons deals, etc., is costing them a bit of their popular support base. On the other hand, the Trump administration is essentially winning or trying to win on an America First ticket. It must get foreign investment to help rebuild infrastructure in poorer Rust Belt parts of the United States. What we have, I think, is the US presidency pushing Saudi Arabia into a corner, backing it into a corner. To put it simply, it's a sort of protection racket. Previously, the United States and the West offered protection to Saudi Arabia in return for Saudi Arabia's performance of the swing oil producer role, the only country, the only economy in the world capable of manipulating oil prices overnight. Since the US shale revolution in 2014, Saudi Arabia has lost that role because of massive non-Saudi, non-OPEC oil supplies, including American oil, hitting the markets. It's no coincidence, I think, that we now have it in 2017 with the US government pretty much forcing Saudi Arabia into a position where it has to spend more than a quarter, possibly a third of its remaining sovereign assets on US-made weapons and investing in US infrastructure in places like Michigan and Ohio. Saudi Arabia absolutely cannot afford this. This is the time that Saudi Arabia must be investing in its own infrastructure to build a post-oil economy. What do we have, though? We have a US presidency that strong-armed it into a position where it has no choice. To put it bluntly, this, I think, is one of the greatest heists of international politics. We see the United States pillaging Saudi Arabia for its remaining assets.
And that was one of Osama bin Laden's points for people who forget. I know he's been totally blacked out. Nobody ever covered anything he ever said. But one of his points was he said during the Gulf War, wait a minute, you've been robbing the treasury from the people of Saudi Arabia to buy all these weapons. And then the minute you get in trouble, you call the Americans in. So what was the point of spending hundreds of billions of dollars over all these years to buy all these weapons if you don't even know how to use them? It's just a kind of an indirect tribute to the stronger empire. That was his point. I mean, nobody cares what he had to say, but
yes, if we go back through the years, we find Saudi Arabia and many of these other oil-rich Gulf monarchies spending several percent of their GDP, in some cases 10% of GDP, on arms purchases, many coming from the United States, Britain and France, most notably. This, I think can be very well described as some sort of protection system. Oil revenues have been recycled back into the West's economies in return for some sort of implicit guarantee that the Western powers will militarily protect the Gulf states. Of course, the George H. Bush administration's intervention in Iraq and Kuwait in 1991 was seen as the gold standard that America and its allies will come if any of us is attacked. The next 30 years is very much a story of massive arms purchases in recognition that the US will come and help them out, as it did with Kuwait in 1991. The problem is now, post-shale revolution, with Saudi Arabia no longer the oil swing producer, that security guarantee is getting weaker and weaker. Hence, we've got Saudi Arabia at possibly the worst time in its history, having to earmark more and more of its funds to go westwards rather than being spent in its own population and its own infrastructure.
I noticed some of your earlier books, the After the Sheikhs, The Coming Collapse of the Gulf Monarchies, Abu Dhabi Oil and Beyond, and the United Arab Emirates, A Study in Survival. Is there any tidbits there that tie into this story of shaking down the Saudi monarchy, and is that part of the reason for the collapse of the Gulf monarchies that you see coming?
Yes. I mean, these earlier books, the main focus was really on this ruling bargain or social contract that exists between citizens and rulers in all of these sorts of states, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, etc., as you mentioned. Essentially, these are distribution-based states where the ruling family and more broadly the government provides subsidies to their population, doesn't tax them, gives free housing, welfare, in exchange for political acquiescence. So their authoritarian state can remain unchallenged and remain in place. Fast forwarding to today, and I don't think anyone could have prophesied this happening as fast as it has, all of these Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, despite its massive oil reserves, are in trouble domestically as well. They're having to cut subsidies. For example, tobacco has doubled in price as subsidies have been removed. High street gasoline prices are going up. Bonuses for civil servants are being removed. Public sector jobs are being frozen. So even at home, these previously stable oil-rich states are no longer as comfortable as they were in the past. That's not to say there'll be a revolutionary situation around the corner, but there could be. But at least there'll be some sort of significant public pressure placed on these regimes like never before. And to go back to our earlier discussion about the United States, this means it's absolutely the wrong time for these sorts of states to be investing abroad. They need to be building a new post-oil economy right now. In fact, they've hired the best consultants, McKinsey, etc. They've brought them in at great expense. McKinsey and others have told them what they need to do. They know they have to diversify. They know they have to do X, Y, and Z. But they're unable to do that because so much money is still having to be recycled out of the region and back to the Western economy. So it's leaving these sorts of Gulf monarchies in an increasingly precarious position, not just because of their proxy war with Iran or threats from ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever else, but simply because the fundamental ruling bargain at the heart of their regimes is being unraveled day by day.
They put a plan in place a survival plan, basically, and now we're going in and sabotaging it.
But if we work on the basis that unelected elites are not necessarily going to serve the national interest before their own interests, we can understand how the political elite will respond to the United States' requests and demands, rather than the future generations of their own country. In this sense, we have, sorry for the political science jargon, but we have a client elite, very clearly, in Saudi Arabia, responding to external demands before the demands of their own population. That's the situation we're in today.
Well,
and we have a client elite in the US and UK.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a...
and our elite are client elite.
That's a key thing you just zeroed in on. I mean, that's the case everywhere, or in every place that we...
At least in the US.
Dominate, right? Isn't that the key to the tactics of the empire? You have to find a client elite who's willing to sell out the rest of their country, sell off the resources. They become very wealthy and powerful, but everyone else is screwed.
Well, you've got a binary choice, really. You're either a client elite, or your country comes up with a client elite and acknowledges them, or you face regime change. So if we look at the resource-rich Arab world, which for many years was oil-rich, but still has various other strategically useful purposes even today beyond oil, when regimes have proved uncooperative, notably the Saddam regime, the Gaddafi regime, the Assad regime, the Saleh regime in Yemen, the list is endless. Regime change then comes on the table. So this is the sort of plan B. If the plan A of upholding a client elite doesn't always work out.
Well, also to the point that Joanne was making, and I think you made in an interesting way from my perspective, is in the U.S. the annual appropriation for the Defense Department is roughly $1 trillion. On paper, it's about $650 billion. Nobody in the country really supports this large military. It's not a very popular thing. The wars abroad are increasingly unpopular. The Iraq War, I think, was somewhat traumatic, almost on par with the Vietnam War, which was it created something political scientists called Vietnam syndrome, which was that people wouldn't support these large engagements anymore after Vietnam. And what's interesting is Trump ran explicitly against large military engagements and involvement. he said in a debate when he attacked Jeb Bush, brother of President George W. Bush, that we went to Iraq, we spent $1 trillion, we lost thousands of lives, and we got nothing. We're stupid. That's a most verbatim quote. Now, it seems as though the people of the country are having their programs cut. Now health insurance, which we had made some gains on, is being rolled back by the Republican Congress. Meanwhile, the military, the Pentagon, is getting a $37 billion increase. So you have to wonder, if we're talking about the client state and populist dislocations between the elite and the domestic population, it would seem that what is happening to Saudi Arabia is also happening here. So even the locus, the motherships have a similar dichotomy. Or do you agree or see that dynamic?
Well, of course, looking at the United States, I'm very much a humble outsider. My take on this is a very, very complex political society. We have a president coming to power who realizes very quickly that he lacks key constituencies that his immediate predecessors enjoyed, including the mainstream media, for the most part, and the intelligence services. If one is faced with that, one is going to have a very uphill struggle to remain president. If one has the mainstream media more or less unified against you, and has the intelligence agencies more or less unified against you. If I was president, I would have probably done exactly what Trump did, reaching out to the DOD, the Pentagon, dramatically increasing the DOD's budget to the levels you just described, and essentially trying to carve out a new constituency for a US president, the likes of which I think haven't been seen since the Dwight Eisenhower presidency. Now, this is very obvious in many ways. Successive presidencies post-JFK, I think, were very, very closely reliant on support from the intelligence agencies and the media. Here we have a presidency that lacked those two pillars, so it's had to, in many ways, reinvigorate elements of the Eisenhower presidency. Now, absolutely, being a president is all about being able to do a cost-benefit analysis. Clearly, you run an election campaign on reducing foreign wars, reducing foreign adventures, not continuing and pursuing the previous administration's various proxy and shadow wars. Now, there are certainly some worrying signs. The various strikes in Syria and Egypt, for example, organized by the US military, which haven't gone particularly well. But let's put it in perspective. They have been one-off. There's been no talk of major military interventions in the Middle East or the Islamic world. And there seems to be less inclination to support some of the proxy measures that the previous administration, notably in Syria and Libya, was getting itself involved in.
So there's a little struggle over that now, but what they do want are people on the rise or looking for more power, the more conventional military forces, the ones where you build tanks and ships and all of that, who have sort of taken a back seat to special forces and intelligence and so on. But while we're on the subject of election, can we get some insights from you on the UK election, since it's next week? Because when the Manchester attack happened, we heard all the pundits saying this is surely going to help the Conservatives, going to benefit. I mean, terrible to take political advantage of a terrorist attack, but certainly this will benefit the Conservatives. But what we're seeing over the past week, I saw Jeremy Corbyn made a statement that seemed pretty mild to me, where he said that, hey, maybe this attack is part of the reason for it is our foreign policy. I mean, he didn't even go too far with what he said, but now there's great backlash against him saying things you're not allowed to say, apparently, and his party is now gaining on the Conservative Party, who called the election because they had such an advantage. Is that at all accurate?
Yes. I think the clue here is in the immediate aftermath of the Manchester attack. Most of the major British newspapers and presumably the British government were very keen to portray the Manchester attack as yet another lone wolf attack, as of course the Westminster attack a few weeks before was also portrayed. Now, lone wolf attacks can be presented to the British public as something nasty, something very tragic, something we need to have national mourning about, discuss about, but ultimately there's nothing we can do to stop them. The problem here for the Conservative government was that the United States intelligence services decided to, and the French intelligence services, decided to leak a little bit about the reality. This was an organized network. I'm sure the Westminster attack was also an organized network as well. Now, when we've got an organized network, we start to have a broader investigation and a broader public debate. In this case, the public debate, if not the investigation, has clearly led to a consensus view in Britain that there's something wrong with our foreign policy, that we've been in bed with the wrong sort of characters. Now, many, don't know the full story about what happened in Libya after 2011. They certainly don't know the full story about the efforts to use the LIFG in the 1990s against Gaddafi, even earlier, even when they were a full-blown part of Al-Qaeda. They don't know the full story, but they hear whisperings here and there. They're able to put things together better than ever before because of social media, because of Facebook, because of Twitter. So even if for the first couple of days the major newspapers were saying lone wolf attack, we don't know anything about it, those foreign intelligence leaks have really propelled the debate in Britain, which I think helps to some extent, but not all. There are certainly important domestic factors as well to do with healthcare, pensions and other issues, which help us understand why this poll lead by the Conservative Party over Labour is narrowing. The problem the Labour Party has ultimately is that they can't really take a different position to the Conservatives over Brexit. Corbyn is well aware that big chunks of his own constituency that he must have voting for him definitely voted for Brexit. So in this sense, we're seeing former UKIP, that was the pro-Brexit Independence Party. UKIP will implode. It was a one-ticket party. It has no purpose post-Brexit. A lot of those votes will go to the Conservatives, some will go to Labour, but it will mainly be an advantage to the Conservatives. So whether we like it or not, the Corbyn campaign will face an uphill struggle, though I expect it to be much narrower than many pundits initially expected.
I have a question related to that, because one of the things you articulated that I think was so true and what we've witnessed is, it's tough to govern if the mainstream media and the intelligence agencies, which are kind of almost two sides of the same coin with Trump, because they're, the intelligence agencies leak intercepted communications to the Washington Post, right? So what I've been very surprised by, someone who is not, I don't know that much about the UK politics, is the antipathy towards Corbyn's statements, and maybe Corbyn generally, if that's a little off topic, but to see, I thought, now maybe this is a misread, I thought The Guardian was the left of center paper, but I've seen The Guardian, man, you see these photo montages and other things. So is the mainstream media in the UK, even after all this time and all this history, still imperialistic? It still supports foreign military interventions, or is it just Corbyn's specific hatred?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that The Guardian is an excellent newspaper, very, very good newspaper on domestic issues. However, when we come to foreign policy, and as you mentioned, imperialism, there is definitely something of a blind spot. This is a sort of liberal imperialism where repeatedly The Guardian has taken positions supporting interventions by Western militaries on the basis of humanitarianism, whether that's Kosovo, Iraq to some extent, Syria definitely to a considerable extent today. But time and again, The Guardian will take that sort of position. It does report on terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, etc. It reports very well on them, but through a very narrow lens about who these characters are, what makes them join these organizations, not what the funders and networks are behind them. Those networks, of course, may well be including our own allies, or in the past, our own governments. These are blind spots The Guardian is unlikely to tackle for the British public. So very, very good on domestic politics, very, very poor on foreign policy, and especially matters which may ultimately embarrass historic British foreign policies or our intelligence agencies.
There are so many similarities now in British and American politics. My partner's a Brit American, but I really didn't start paying attention to British politics until after 9/11 when I was looking for another perspective, because it was the perspective from here was, just very confusing. Let's just put it that way. Opaque. Let's say opaque. And at the time, the politics in Britain and the politics here seemed to be extremely different. There was no lining up of the parties, but I think in the past 15, 16 years, there's a lot of recognizable trends there and here. Even some of the parties, the giant split in the Labour Party, the giant split in the Democratic Party. And there's one more thing, I guess, again, on empire. So we know about the British Empire, and at some point there was a transition to the American Empire. But was it really? What is the empire that we're dealing with right now? Is it the American Empire? Is it the British American Empire? Is it a Western Empire? I mean, it's very amorphous. It's not just American.
Well, I think this was a long predicted scenario. I think we're now very much in an era of so-called unified imperialism, where the size of the companies, many of which are multinationals, you look at BP, for example, the old Anglo-Persian oil, no longer just British Petroleum, the United States, major investments in BP too. So these companies are truly multinational. They have global interests. They're headquartered in the West. The Western powers, of course, since the mid-20th century, have largely settled their own differences with each other, despite spats over the EU or NAFTA or whatever else. By and large, the Western powers have more or less coalesced into a unified imperialist stance, where they can more collectively project their influence around the world. Very sadly and unfortunately for the Arab world and most of the Islamic world, that has not only been on the doorstep of the Western powers, and as it were in the middle of the world as a sort of buffer zone between other major powers such as Russia and China, but it's also been an incredibly strategically useful and resource-rich buffer zone and part of the developing world, right on the doorstep of this unified imperialist bloc.
Well, it's interesting because I would have thought, that's an interesting idea, the unified imperialism, because I actually thought that there was a transition point, which was the Suez Crisis, when the U.S., this was, I guess, the 1950s. This is with Nasser, actually, about pan-Arabism. And the French and the British kind of went in to reclaim imperial status. And from what I understand, Eisenhower said, if you're done, you're basically done to the British. And if you do that, we'll attack the pound and there'll be all sorts of problems for you. Of course, then later, our next president decided to try to reclaim French colonial Vietnam for some reason. But okay, I think your unified theory makes sense. So they're not even a pecking order, you think? I mean, I know there's things like the Atlantic Council, which, I mean, it's funny, Angela Merkel just said she's an Atlanticist, which struck me as odd because she was saying that was in opposition to Trump, who's the president of the United States. So I don't know. Any take on that?
Yes, I think certainly in the 1950s, 1960s, certainly the post-Second World War period, when I think it could be better described as a period of increasing internationalization rather than globalization. So the power of the multinationals are less important. We definitely do have this hierarchy or pecking order, as you put it, being established. 1950s, 1960s, we have Britain and France very much on the decline. Their empires are very much in full retreat. We have the United States playing a very careful game, wanting to take over spheres of influence, but at the same time not wanting British or French influence to completely collapse, lest it create vacuums in the developing world that the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, or other communist regimes can jump into and occupy. So we have the United States very carefully playing this game. As a sort of useful role, the United Nations is criticizing British and French empires, talking about the need for self-determination, etc. But of course, this is happening in parallel with the United States very much pushing to one side its original revolutionary goals and ideals, which of course we shouldn't forget the French Empire itself was quickly able to push to one side by the mid-19th century.
Right, and that's when it becomes, hear the criticism here, it goes from colonialism to, quote, NeoColonialism, where you no longer have settler colonial forces go in and actually occupy, but you use sort of debt right? This is the Bretton Woods. I think Bretton Woods is post-World War II system, right? Where you essentially have the World Bank and other people kind of loan sharking people. And then it kind of makes sense if a corporatization is happening, right? That there's limited interventions, but you're not actually colonizing anymore.
Yes, I mean, I think we have a situation from the 1950s up to the end of the 1980s where there was a feeling that if client elites are in place that ultimately suit our Western interests, then it's actually a good thing if their economies grow. We want them to become markets that can be accessed and exploited. We want to give them a helping hand. We want to provide economic aid. We want to provide military aid. We want to help train their security services in JFK's case. And we also want to help them integrate with us more and more, but in a very unequal sort of manner. We have a problem though. By the 1980s, many of these Arab and Latin American and other developing parts of the world, our client elites are not doing very well. They're becoming unpopular. The economies they're presiding over are not performing particularly well. So we have this shift to the sort of next stage, which would be the neoliberal approach, to get them to give up their state-led economic development policies and basically open up their economies completely to us, removing minimum wages, dismantling trade unions. Places like Egypt and Tunisia were the poster boys for this by 2010, and of course they ended up with these massive wealth gaps, huge poverty, crony capitalist elites, and essentially a population that wanted to oust their rulers, who were of course two of our best client elites in the region.
That's an interesting way of looking at neoliberalism as kind of a swing back to, because in Chile at least, we actually sent in a group called the Chicago Boys, which were connected to Milton Friedman, and they essentially became, I guess in a sense, colonial managers, meaning they were essentially, the economy of Chile was essentially turned over to them and secured by the Pinochet government. So maybe that was like retro colonial management, or is it totally different?
If one can hide the colonial administrators behind a puppet, behind a client, or whoever the dictator may be, this, I think, for a big chunk of the 20th century, was seen as a very good way of doing it. I mean, you mentioned the Chilean case. The United States had major copper mining companies that were standing to lose greatly in Chile and elsewhere in America. Similarly, in Guatemala, where you have the United Fruit Company owning vast tracts of arable land. What was particularly interesting about the Chile campaign was how the CIA also started to get involved in PR. They knew the Pinochet regime was going to be unpopular, not just in Chile but internationally. So they started to run an international PR campaign, even printing pamphlets and getting PR companies involved to try and whiten the image of the Chilean government as a suitable trade and investment partner elsewhere in the world.
I could pick your brain all day, but we haven't held you for an hour. I kind of feel bad. So
we're at like
closing,
about an hour, and okay. So I think we've taken a lot of your time here. And is there anything else that you'd like to say, tell us about before we wrap this up?
Well, many thanks for having me on my show. Obviously, given the particularly devastating events in Britain recently, and also France and Belgium and elsewhere, I've naturally taken a keener interest in what's happening here in Western Europe. One area I feel strongly about, and I myself may not have the resources and ability to do this, but I would strongly encourage other researchers to get involved, is to look at the funding flows into mosques in Western European countries. A lot of these funding flows seem strongly connected to countries in the Middle East, with which we've been selling weapons to, with which we've been entering into alliances with. And it seems to me that our governments may have been turning, wrongly, a very blind eye to the sort of messages that are being spread in our own religious communities, especially the Muslim community in Britain, France, Germany, etc.
Sounds great.
Sounds interesting. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. It was great to talk to you.
You too.
Right, have a good one.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Dr. Davidson. Follow Dr. Davidson on Twitter at dr_Davidson. Find his work at christopherdavidson.net. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to our Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire. Follow us on Twitter at aroundtheempire. And subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our page on Facebook. Questions, comments, want to yell at me? Dan@shatterproof.com. See you next time.
Take care. And thanks so much to our patrons.